This little book is pretty much an overview of what is left to do in order to have the small churches all over the country set to survive on their own. It's also got some information in it that's healthy for us to consider. And so it's been preserved in the scriptures for us. This morning is going to be mostly introduction, but at least we'll be started in the text by the time we're through. Paul calls himself the slave or the servant of God. And there's a mixture, I think, of humility and pride in that statement. He thinks of himself as the undisputed possession of God. He had no will of his own, no time of his own. His life was totally submitted to God. And that's just the way he approaches everything that he does. But I also think there's a bit of pride in that statement of being the slave of God, or the servant of God, the doulos theo in Greek. The slave of God was a title they gave to the old prophets, the ancient great ones in the past. Moses in Joshua chapter 1 verse 2 is referred to as a servant or slave of God, depending on your translation. Servant carries with it the idea of a slave. You had very few rights. And Joshua himself was called the servant or slave of God in chapter 24 verse 29. And all the prophets were called the slaves of God in Amos chapter 3. Jeremiah 7 verse 25 says, God does nothing unless he reveals his secrets to the servants, his servants, the prophets. So Paul sees himself walking in this great succession of the prophets, the holy men of God. And Paul also knew that as the envoy of Christ, that he had the authority to speak. And he makes that point here, as he usually does in his letters. He usually makes it a point to establish his authority to say the things he's fixing to say. So we can pay attention. Going further still, we see the essence of Paul's gospel and the central core of his task is outlined in this little book. His message was one of new life. We would say eternal life. And for Paul, there was only one being who could claim legitimately that kind of life. That was God. And so the offer of Christ is a share in the very life of God. And that's what he's wanting to communicate to these people. Paul knew there were two things necessary to bring people into that life of God. First, he had to awaken the faith in their hearts. And without the faith, we can never please God. You remember that it says in the Hebrew letter. To Paul, this meant total and complete trust, absolute trust in God. So the first step in the Christian life is to realize that we can do nothing but receive. In every part of life, no matter how great or how precious the offer is, it remains an offer until it is received. Even God's offer. So our duty as Christians is to persuade others to accept the offer of God, to share in his very life. The truth is, we can't argue or coerce a person into being a Christian or a disciple of Jesus. All we can say is what Philip told Nathanael when he told Nathanael he found the Messiah, and it was Jesus of Nazareth. Nathanael's comment, can anything good come from Nazareth? And Philip told him, says, come and see. It's about all we can do with people around us, is invite them to come and see. And see the Lord is good. Since before the fall of man in the garden, the purpose of God has been to redeem mankind and restore the relationship we had with Him in the rule of the earth. He has always known that it is critical for us that He rescue us, see, and He's prepared to do that. And we see that in the way that things came about. In verse 3, Paul says, in due time, or at the right time, God made His plans known. Not only when Israel was prepared to receive the Messiah, but also when the whole world was prepared. Many interesting things played into that. And I'm going to list a few of them here for you to think about. Practically all the world spoke the Greek language in those days. It was used in trade, it was used in commerce, it was used in literature. It may have been a second language for most everybody, but nearly everybody knew it because that's how business was transacted. And wherever you went in the empire, if you knew Greek, you could get on. You could get by. It's kind of like English in our world today. If you know English, you can pretty much travel most places. There were no frontiers. The Roman Empire was pretty much equal to the known world. And so, and even now, if you travel most parts of the world, you need a passport, or else you'll be held up at border crossings and maybe even prevented from going into a country if you don't. Not so in the empire. It was free travel, pretty much like our country is for us right now. So missionaries could travel wherever they needed to or wanted to. And so it was easy for them to spread the word. Travel was relatively easy. Although it was slow, you had to walk or ride a donkey, which is slow, but the Roman roads were excellent. In fact, many of them are still present today in different sections. You see the old road beds, still the stones and stuff still in place, with no maintenance, mind you, for 2,000 years. How would our good roads hold up for that long, you reckon? No. And also, because the empire, they had been cleared of robbers and pirates, so travel was fairly safe. Maybe not everywhere, but mostly it was safe. The world was largely at peace. And they talk about the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, or the Pax Augustus. He's the one that started it, the peace of Augustus, the Caesar. And it was peaceful. Some would say they scald the countryside and then they brag about their peace. It came at a very high price. But at the time, for about a 200-year period there, it was relatively peaceful. No wars, no insurrections or anything like that. Because the Roman army had put things down so hard, so roughly, that no one dared raise their hand. The world was also aware of its needs, and it was looking for a hand up, we would say, from the God of heaven, or the gods of heaven, whatever they were looking for some kind of divine relief. And our Father had not only prepared the situation specifically in Israel for the Messiah to come, but He had prepared the people of the whole world to receive the message of Christ and salvation. The whole world was prepared. Okay, for Titus, there's no one passage that gives us a history of Titus. We just have to hunt for little clues and tidbits here and there to piece together his story or his life. Paul calls him my son in the faith, so likely Paul converted him. It doesn't ever really say that, but that's just kind of an assumption. Paul took Titus with him to Jerusalem. The church in Jerusalem was suspect of Paul because when he was a young fella, he had been there and he was persecuting people big time, oppressing them, putting them in prison. We know when Stephen was stoned, Paul was there. He was holding everybody's coats. I don't know why he wasn't throwing rocks, but he was there overseeing maybe the death of Stephen. He took Titus with him to Jerusalem, and he also took Barnabas. It says in Galatians chapter 2 that Barnabas was. So when Paul was up against the wall there in Jerusalem, Titus and Barnabas were there with him. They helped him. We know Barnabas was he's called son of encouragement. He was just the kind of guy that would stand up with you, back you up, and he would not let you be mistreated or run down. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 16, Paul mentions that Titus apparently delivered a somewhat caustic letter to the Corinth church, possibly the first Corinthian letter that we have. I know there's one that's missing. Paul says that Titus accepted the exhortation. In other words, he took it to heart, the things that were said, and then he also volunteered to deliver the letter. So he's definitely one that could bring order out of chaos. He was a good man to do that. Paul had chosen him to oversee the collection that was taken up for the poor saints in Jerusalem. In chapter 8, verses 6 and 10, he's evidently not much of a preacher. He doesn't ever say a lot about his preaching, but he could get the job done. And he did share in the work of teaching. Paul has a few titles that you can kind of latch on to for Titus. He's called his true child in verse 4 of chapter 1. He calls him a brother in 2 Corinthians 2. He calls him a share in the work and toil in chapter 8. And he says that he walked in the same spirit as Paul. Okay, now you can pick up here in your text in verse 5. He lists many things. He starts out with talking about the qualifications, if you want to use that word, the qualifications of elders. What kind of men would be good to lead a church, a congregation? What do you expect them to be, and what should you expect to receive from them? Okay, Paul left Titus in Crete to be an example to the believers there. We would say, or we have a saying where a picture is worth 1,000 words. So that's what he's hoping that Titus is going to be there and live before them and teach not only by his words but by his example. He is to show them or set in order the things that are lacking. In other words, to organize things a little bit. And so that's his job description. He was to appoint elders in every city. And that's what this map is about. And you may end up having to come up here and look at it, or maybe you'd be more inclined to go home on your computer and Google your own picture of it. If you Google Crete, it'll come up just about like this. This one is a road map, modern day, and we're talking 2,000 years old now, so it's probably not that cluttered, but it could have been. Because, I say that because Homer, the Greek poet, ancient Greek poet, 800 years before the time of Jesus and Paul, wrote a statement. He called it Crete of 100 cities. And so, and the island is, I think, 3,200 square miles. It's about the size of a good big ranch. 3,200 square miles. I don't know how big Tennessee is, but I should have looked. That'd be something to give us a comparison. But anyway, all right, let me find my place here. He goes on to explain what an elder's life should look like. And I took these qualifications from the Amplified version, so it's going to be a little bit wordy, but I think it communicates the thoughts better. It helps us to understand some of the words that we don't use all that often. The first one is that he should be blameless. And that's not sinless, okay? It's not a perfect man, but just a man of unquestionable integrity. He had to be well spoken of and thought of. He is the husband of one wife. We might say he was a one-woman man. It's not a big issue in Middle Tennessee in 2023, but in Crete in those days, you could have a number of wives, and it was legal. And so to find a man who was devoted to just one woman was somewhat unusual. You must have children who believe. That speaks of the man as well as of his children. He was to be one who had no accusations of immorality or rebellious. And now I don't know so much today. I haven't heard it in a long time. Rita was reminding me of it this morning. That used to, if you wanted to slur somebody, or if somebody was acting really crude and rude, they might be called a Cretan. Quit acting like a Cretan. So that the reputation of those people carried for close to 2,000 years there. He says an overseer is God's steward. Is not extravagant. He's not wasteful. He's not self-willed or arrogant. He's not quick-tempered. That's hard to find anymore, isn't it? It means you can't drive on the interstate. You can't be that way. He's not addicted to wine. And some of these I'm just going to state because they're pretty much self-explanatory. He's not violent. He's not greedy for dishonest gain. He's not financially unethical, we might say. He's completely above board in how he makes his living, and he's generous in his personality. He must be hospitable to believers and strangers as well, a lover of what is good. And he must be sensible or upright. Must be fair, devout, self-disciplined. Must be above reproach in private and in public. Paul says he must hold firmly to the trustworthy word as he was taught. So he will be able to give accurate instructions and reliable teachings. be able to refute those who contradict by explaining their errors. That's my thoughts for this morning.